Good morning, everyone. My name's Pastor Dan, and I'm the pastor here at Rexmont EC Church in Rexmont, Pennsylvania, the southern end of beautiful Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. I want to welcome you to our message this morning. This is Palm Sunday. And so this day in the Christian calendar begins Holy Week. What we're celebrating this Sunday is that Christ would have made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, knowing he was going to be betrayed, knowing he was going to die. If we look at the whole of the Christian church calendar for this season, we would have started the season of Lent with our Ash Wednesday service, and we did that as a church 7 weeks ago. And we talked a little bit about denying yourself, giving something up, and in replace of that, to focus our eyes and our lives on Jesus and what He has done for us over this for this coming week, I guess. So the last 7 weeks have been preparing us for this Holy Week. Today is Palm Sunday, which begins Holy Week. This coming Thursday, we call Maundy Thursday. The word Maundy, it comes from the Latin word mandatum, which translates command. Actually, we get our English word mandate from it. And it refers to the instructions that Jesus gave his disciples during the Last Supper. They'd joined together for the Last Supper. He had washed his disciples' feet. He had offered them communion. And part of the Passover meal was where he instituted the communion. And in John 13:34, Jesus says, "A new command I give to you, mandatum, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Many churches do hold foot washing and communion services on Maundy Thursday. We're going to be getting together as a church with several other churches in the area at our Lawn EC Church for Maundy Thursday communion service in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening. I'm pretty sure we're not going to do a foot washing, though. Because we realize that not everyone can make it to Maundy Thursday communion service, we are doing communion service at the end of this service here today in church. If you are watching this on video and you would like me to come and serve you communion in your home because you're not able to come today or Thursday, please send me a note, put a message down in the comments. As long as you're somewhere in central Pennsylvania, I will be more than happy to come and serve you communion. It's perfectly fine if you are here for worship service this morning and you take communion to also take it on Thursday. Jesus said, as often as you do this, and not only do this once in a while, as often as you do it in remembrance of me. After Thursday, many churches also hold a Good Friday service in remembrance of the day that Jesus was crucified. Good Friday is when most people end their Lent, lay down the stuff that they gave up. They can pick that back up again. Whatever they gave up for Lent, Good Friday is the last day for that. Then Easter morning, we celebrate the risen Christ. Some churches do a very early in the morning sunrise service because the Bible tells us that early in the morning, the women discovered the tomb was empty. And then oftentimes churches do a Sunday morning Easter service, and that's what we're going to do. We're not going to do a Good Friday or a sunrise service. We will have our regular Easter morning service. All of these special services, and some churches do all of them and some pick and choose, it is built so that you don't get swept away in the busyness of life here, and you can root yourselves in the remembrance of what Jesus did on the cross and how that should really change how you interact with the world around you. While this is Palm Sunday and we do have palm branches here in church for this morning, um, we're actually not going to spend time today looking at Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We've done that the last couple of years, and so we're going to go in a slightly different direction today. Instead, we're going to spend our time in John chapter 15. What we've been doing for the last number of weeks has been walking through the 7 I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John, and we're going to continue that today. We've been saying during this study that it's one thing to understand what Jesus does, but it's another thing to understand who he is. Our confidence in what he has done for us and what he has accomplished on the cross is rooted in who he is, because if he's not who he said he was, then what he has accomplished doesn't matter. We're really focused on in this series on this is who Jesus says he is. There's 7 of these I am statements in the Gospel of John. Today we're going to look at the statement, I am the true vine. Just so you can get your mind in your mind the context of what Jesus is teaching here. When he is giving this teaching, we're probably just 4 or 5 hours away from Jesus being arrested at this point in the story. He's saying these things knowing that it's not long before he is going to be crucified. So since we're going to be talking about vines and gardens, I thought I might as well show you this picture here. It's this is a grapevine on the side of a building. This grapevine actually has its own name. Zamatovka is the name of this particular grapevine. It's listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest grapevine in the world that is still producing fruit. The old vine is located in Maribor, Slovenia, and was planted at the end of the Middle Ages, over 450 years ago, 1570. Old vine. But here's the point, and I don't know if you missed this when I said it the first time. It's not the age that it's impressive, although that's still impressive, 450 years old. What's most impressive is that this particular vine is still giving fruit. Over the past 450 years, there have been so many gardeners who have taken care of this particular vine, and it's still producing good fruit. They still make wine every year out of the fruit that's produced by this 450-year-old vine. We've been studying the I am statements for the past number of years, number of weeks. These statements were the way that Jesus revealed himself and his mission to the world, and to his disciples, of course, because most of the time he was speaking to them when he was giving these I am statements. This statement that he gives is a little bit different from some of the other statements because it's specifically directed towards Jesus' relationship both with his disciples and with his church that will grow up. One thing true about every kind of person from every kind of culture is that when we eat food, we often eat food with others. People eat food with other people, which is no surprise to us. We do this all the time. It's a human thing, which is why, just so you're clear, if you decide to eat McDonald's by yourself in your car 5 days a week, you're doing it wrong. A couple of days a week, not a problem, but 5, that's a little excessive. Now, I'm sharing meals with others is a good thing, and what I love about sharing a meal with someone isn't the food, although I do admit food is important, but it's not the food that's really, really important. It's the conversation that happens around the food. And usually it's the conversation that oftentimes happens not while you're eating because you're getting up and getting things and passing stuff. It's the conversation that happens after you're done eating. Think about the times you had dinner with your friends, either recently or just in general, and think about the after dinner conversations. That's where friendship really grows. That's where friendship really happens. After dinner conversations are important. And that's what's going on here in John chapter 15. The setting of John chapter 15 goes all the way back to John chapter 13, where Jesus is in Jerusalem with his disciples. It's Thursday night, the day before Jesus is going to be crucified. He's going to be arrested later that night. Jesus and his disciples are having dinner together. And everything from that we read from chapter 13 verse 4 all the way through chapter 17 is a conversation that happens after the dinner. Judas Iscariot, the one who is going to betray Jesus, has already left in chapter 13, verse 30. And so by the end of chapter 13 and in chapter 14, chapter 15 that we're going to read today, it's a conversation that's happening just between Jesus and his 11 closest friends. When we read this, it's almost like we get to be part of that after dinner conversation with them. And what Jesus says here in these chapters makes this, I think, the greatest after dinner conversation ever. This morning, we're going to look at chapter 15, which is a continuation of what we saw last week in chapter 14 when we were talking about sheep and shepherds and things. Jesus is meaning to speak words of comfort to his disciples, even though he knows he's going to be needing comfort. He makes sure he blesses and comforts his disciples. He says in twice in chapter 14, once in chapter 14, verse 1, again in verse 27, do not let your hearts be troubled. He's saying things to comfort their hearts, not trouble their hearts. And even more than that, in chapter 15, verse 11, Jesus says, I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Even though he was getting ready to go to the cross and he knew it and he didn't want to go to the cross, we see that over and over in scripture where he asks God to take the cup from him. He still has joy and he still wants to pass that joy on to the disciples. That's amazing. You know, Jesus is talking with his closest friends after dinner and he's saying what he's saying so that they'll have the full experience of the joy that they will ever know. And he starts in chapter 15, verse 1, where we're going to spend our time with the I am statement. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. The focus is on the vine. The main thing we need to know is this passage is that he tells us in verse 1 that he is the true vine. And he'll repeat that I am statement again in verse 5. So we'll get it again. I wish I knew something about gardening, but I don't. I do not have a green thumb. I always joke that I can't even grow grass. Some of you might love gardening, and if so, you might really connect with Jesus' metaphor. But the truth of the matter is that this story, this metaphor that Jesus is, it doesn't matter whether you know anything about gardening or not, because Jesus is doing something more than just talking about gardening. When Jesus says he's the true vine, he's actually making a critical allusion to the Old Testament. Because in the Old Testament, and especially in the prophetic books like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the metaphor of a vine is used over and over again to represent the people of Israel, God's chosen people. And so what Jesus is doing here when he calls himself the vine is he's not really trying to connect us with gardening. He's connecting himself to this image we read about in the Old Testament. And unfortunately, in the Old Testament, every time the vine image is used in reference to Israel, almost every time it's a negative. I'm going to read you a couple of examples, but the gist of why it's negative is that God planted Israel as a vine to produce good fruit, but Israel failed to do that. And because Israel failed to be a vine that produces good fruit, God brought judgment on them. So let me read just a couple of things. Jeremiah 2:19-21. And this is God speaking to Israel. He says, "Your wickedness will punish you. Your backsliding will rebuke you. Consider then and realize how evil and bitter it is for you when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of me, declares the Lord Almighty. Long ago, you broke off your yoke and tore off your bonds. You said, I will not serve you. Indeed, on every high hill and under every spreading tree, you lay down as a prostitute." And here's the key verse, verse 21. "I had planted you like a choice vine, a sound and reliable stock. How then did you turn against me into a corrupt, wild vine?" Uh, uh, Ezekiel chapter 19, this is a lament about Israel by the prophet Ezekiel. He says in verse 10, "Your mother was like a vine in your vineyard planted by the water. It was fruitful, full of branches because of abundant water. Its branches were strong, fit for ruler's scepter. It towered high above the thick foliage, conspicuous for its height and for its many branches. But it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel. It was stripped of its fruit. Its strong branches withered, and fire consumed them. Now it is planted in the desert, in a dry and thirsty land." The nation of Israel had failed being the vine for the people. But Israel was not the vine that God intended them to be. They had failed. So why then is Jesus claiming to be the vine? It's because Jesus is saying that where Israel failed, he will not fail. Jesus is the true vine, which means he's the truer and better Israel. So in all the places where Israel wavered, Jesus will hold fast. In all the places where Israel sinned, Jesus will overcome. In all the places where Israel forsook God over and over and over again, Jesus will trust God all the way to the very end. This connection to the Old Testament sets up a whole trajectory of this conversation. Jesus is going to talk about branches and he's going to talk about the gardener, but what he says only makes sense if we know that the focus here is on the vine. The focus of this whole conversation is that everything about the world and everything about God's history with humanity is now changing because of Jesus. When Jesus came to the earth, he came to be the true and better Israel that Israel failed to be. And he came to be a true and better human than we have all failed to be. And this isn't just a side note about what Jesus did. This is the heart of the rescue mission. When Jesus says, I am the true vine, this is who he says he is. The kind of savior we need, that you and I need, is not just one who can get us out of trouble, but we need a savior who can walk in our shoes and go through all that we've gone through and perfectly trust God and always do what he says and truly love even when it's hard. And then take all that righteousness and all that power and give it to us. That's what we need. And that's what Jesus has done. He doesn't just give his death, but he gives us life. He gives us his holiness. He gives us his fruitfulness. Remaining in him is what makes the difference. And that's the second truth we see in John 15. Jesus, with himself as the focus, talks about branches. Vines have branches. And in this image, Jesus says that we are the branches. Jesus' disciples, those who trust him and follow him, are the branches. And right away, the gardener also comes into view. The gardener is God the Father. And the gardener is the one who works to take care of the branches. Jesus says that in verse 2. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. There are two categories here. There are unfruitful branches that are being removed, and there are fruitful branches that are pruned so that they'll produce more fruit. And sometimes when we read this, maybe you've heard it taught this way by other pastors, we get caught up in this anxiety of, oh no, am I one of the bad branches or one of the good branches? Am I unfruitful or am I fruitful? I've heard this taught before where the central message was a warning that branches better be fruitful or you're going to be cut off and burned. And I just want to be clear, that is not what is going on here at all. Remember, Jesus had just told his disciples in the previous chapter, let not your hearts be troubled. He's saying all that he's saying so they'll have the fullness of joy. Jesus is not warning his disciples. He's not warning us here. Now, there are warnings in the Bible. This one just isn't one of them. Jesus is encouraging his disciples here. And in case we miss it, he makes that very clear in the very next verse, verse 3. In verse 2, the fruitful branches are pruned branches. In verse 3, Jesus says, you are already clean because of the word they've spoken to you. And when Jesus says you are clean, he means you're pruned. These two words are actually the same word in Greek. Pruned is kathariri, and cleaned is katharoi. The same word. One is a verb, one is a noun, but it's the same word. One of my friends in Kenya had this little saw on a pole and you could extend it up, and it's meant for trimming high branches and trees. And I had a peach tree in my yard right beside my house, and every once in a while I would need to go out and give that peach tree a bit of a trim so that the branches didn't bang up and down on the roof of my house in the wind. But rather than try and climb up into the tree with my handsaw and my panga, my machete, I asked to borrow my friend's extend-a-saw and trim those high branches. I trimmed it, I pruned it, I cleaned it up. That's what Jesus means here. When he tells the disciples that they're clean, he's saying that they have been pruned, which means he's assuring them they will not be cut off and trashed. Here, Jesus is comforting the hearts of his disciples by telling them he has pruned them, he has cleaned them. They are good, fruitful branches because they are part of the vine, which he explains as remaining in him. That's what verse 4 says. Jesus says, remain in me, and I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, but it must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. So simply put, the branch is impossible without the vine. There's no such thing as a branch by itself. There's no such thing as a branch just sitting around by itself producing fruit. Branches only bear fruit when they're connected to the vine. And Jesus says it's the same way with him. And he makes it clear again in verse 5. Jesus says, I am the vine. He repeats the I am statement. I am the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. In the same way that a branch is connected to the vine, in the same way that a branch has meaning and sustenance and life and fruit in the vine, Jesus' disciples remain in him. Verse 6, Jesus continues. He says, if you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. Here's the warning. If you don't remain in him, then you're thrown away and used for the bonfire. Because when you don't remain in Jesus, you're not a branch producing fruit, you're a dead stick. Remaining in Jesus is what makes the difference. If you don't remain in Jesus, you're not part of this thing. But if you do remain in Jesus, you're a branch of the vine and you will be fruitful. There are two things we need to understand. What does it mean to remain, and what does it mean to be fruitful? We've got to understand what Jesus means with these two words in order to understand what he's saying. So what does it mean to remain in Jesus? I think visually this makes sense to us in the same way that a branch is connected with the vine. To remain means to stay. It's to stay connected. And we can see that with our minds, but that still doesn't get at what it means to remain. A little while later in verse 9, Jesus says, remain in my love. And he explains that if you keep my commandments, you remain in his love. So now there's Jesus and there's his love, and there's keeping his commandments. And all that has something to do with remaining, which I think simplifies it a bit for us. We shouldn't complicate what Jesus says here. Remaining is another way for Jesus to talk about faith. To remain in Jesus is to have faith in Jesus. Faith means more than sending Jesus a thumbs up emoji. Faith is deeply relational. Faith is holding on and hiding in. It's clinging tight and standing firm. It's eating your fill and drinking your heart out. It's digging in your heels when it seems like the ground beneath your feet is shaking. You just grab onto Jesus with your whole soul. Even when you know your embrace is as pathetic as a mustard seed, you embrace him until your knuckles turn white and you lose all feeling in your hands and you don't let go. Whatever you do, you do not let go of him because he's not letting go of you. That's what the embrace is all about. You embrace him, however weak it is, in that you know he is holding on to you in return. That's what faith is. And that's where this vine image is so helpful. This is a vital union between a vine and its branches. And in the same way, there's a vital union between you and God, between Jesus and those who trust him. We don't stand back away from him and send him our faith. Our faith in Jesus means we're inseparably connected to him, so much so that there's no such thing as me apart from him. Jesus says in verse 5, apart from me, you can do nothing. And the truth is, apart from him, we are nothing. That's what it means to be branches of the vine. There are no branches without the vine. That's what remaining in Jesus looks like. That's what it means to believe in him. Which, in case you're wondering right now whether you're remaining him or not, if you've been thinking about this the whole time about whether you're in a fruitful branch, the answer is to trust Jesus. Put your faith in Jesus. Believing in Jesus is what it means to remain in Jesus. And if you remain in Jesus, you'll be fruitful. So what does fruitful mean? Well, I think Jesus tells us in this passage. Check out verse 7. Jesus says, if you remain in me and my words remain in you. Now, hold on. Remember, Jesus already said that back in verse 4. In verse 4, he said, you remain in me and I in you in order to be fruitful. And here in verse 7, he says, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. Which means I think he's talking about answered prayer. Remaining in Jesus in verse 4 means fruitfulness. Remaining in Jesus in verse 7 means answered prayer. And I don't think these two things are different. They're the same thing. Look in verse 16. Look, Jesus says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. Bearing fruit that remains is equated with answered prayer. It goes like this. Jesus chose you and appointed you so that you would bear fruit, which is to say your prayers would be answered, so that whatever you ask in the Father's name, he may give it to you. I love that word, whatever God wants to give us. We've talked about this before on Sunday morning. John 10:10, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. In your prayers, what are you asking for? Are you asking God for a complete and full life? Are you asking him for the small stuff? Are you asking for the vineyard? Or are you asking just for a bowl of grapes? If we think of answered prayers only when God gives us those things that we ask for every 2 or 3 years, if that's what we think answered prayer is, it's a bowl of grapes. If we think asking for prayer means, Lord, give me a pony. Lord, help me pass this test. We're not asking for the right things. So often when we read verses like John 15:7, where Jesus tells us, ask anything and it will be done for us, we want to put Jesus on the hot seat. We say, really, Jesus? Are you serious? We read this verse and we scrutinize Jesus, but instead of what we should be doing is turning the tables on ourselves. The real point in Jesus' statement here isn't that it will be done. The real question is, what are we asking for? Jesus said he will give us whatever we ask. So are we asking for his kingdom to come? Are we asking for the sun to rise and for the heavens to declare the glory of God? Are we asking for his spirit to strengthen us? Are we asking for him to give us the power to understand his grace more deeply? Are we asking that he keep us safe every night? That's a powerful, powerful prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. Lord, I pray my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, Lord, I pray my soul to take. God has always answered that prayer for me. Every night, God answers it because he keeps my soul. And someday, on that morning when I don't wake up, he'll still have answered it. The more we pray God's will, the more answered prayers will become every little way that we experience and comprehend the activity of God in our lives. Fruitfulness, being answered prayer, doesn't reduce fruitfulness, it expands it. It's obedience. Yes, it's obedience. Yes, it's love, it's patience, it's witness, and it's endurance. Fruitfulness is every way that God is working in and through your lives, because that's what we're praying for. And it's just what happens when you're a branch connected to the vine. And one more thing, and this I think is most important: the gardener gets the glory. Jesus mentions God the Father right away in verse 1. He's the one who's tending to the vine. He's doing the pruning. He's cleaning it up. And when it comes to answered prayer, verse 8, when it comes to fruitfulness, Jesus says, "This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." The one who tends to the branch of the vine, he's glorified by its fruit. God the Father wants to see his work displayed in our lives because he's glorified by that. Your fruitfulness, the display of God's work in your life, even in just the smallest ways, says something wonderful about him. It glorifies him, it magnifies him. And the disciples were sitting around the table in the middle of this epic after dinner conversation, and maybe their heads were spinning at least a little bit. Jesus had told them all this so that they would have joy, so that his joy would be in them, that their joy would be full. And this truth about the Father is a cause of joy, because it means this whole thing is his doing. All of this, the whole thing, he has done it all. We're just branches. We're just branches on a vine that is truer and better than anything we could ever dream of. We're just glad to be here. We're part of this thing that is so much bigger and beyond us and not up to us. The gardener is the one who is handling all this, and he's the one who gets the glory. And that gives us joy.